I need to lodge an FIR for Dr. Bhavani. No, he's there. Okay. Ketan Parekh?
Oh, he's coming there.
Has he chickened out? No, there he comes running. Okay. So welcome all of you to this post-coffee session of our panel discussion. And we have a set of 5 panelists, both from the national arena and the international arena. And it is a rarity. You'll find all of them on the same platform. Don't spare them. Grill them. You will never find them all on the same platform again in the coming years. So just a short introduction. Maybe you could focus the first slide. The first one, Dr. Kajal. She is an additional professor from PGI Chandigarh. Dr. Kaman, past president of SOAP from Boston. Then Dr. Purva, she comes from Hull Infirmary in UK. Dr. Ketan Parekh, a senior consultant anesthetist from Mumbai, Breach Candy. And Dr. Bhavani, coming from the same place, Brigham and Women's Hospital. He has basically done his post-graduation, everything from JIPMER, and now he's associated with the Harvard Medical School, Boston. So I hope we are able to fill up the vacant seats soon. And the organizers have given us a very interesting topic, and that is TAPs and mishaps. Yes. So TAPs and mishaps, and I managed to get all their photographs here. So now we'll talk about different case scenarios. I have prepared about 7 to 8 case scenarios. I'll ask you questions, identify the case, how you would manage them, and let's see then what the panelists say whether our management strategies are fine. So the first case scenario, a 27-year-old gravida 2 para 1 term, 165 centimeters, 68 kg. She was in labor. She requested for labor analgesia. A multiport catheter was inserted, L45, and 12 ml of 0.25% of bupivacaine was given. 10 ml per hour infusion, and with fentanyl. At 30 minutes, she was not very comfortable, so they again repeated the same dose. Again, after 20 minutes, though she had some amount of motor weakness in her lower limbs, but still she was not very happy, so they gave her 7 ml of 2% lignocaine with epinephrine. And then you find that she had some motor weakness. Since she was not yet happy with her epidural, they decided to remove the catheter and placed in a combined spinal epidural. And they gave the same dose up here, 12 ml of 0.25% bupivacaine with 2 mics per ml of fentanyl. And she had good analgesia. And later on, the catheter was removed after 5 hours. Subsequent to that, at 5 hours, the anesthesiologist found that before that she was wriggling her toes. Now she had stopped wriggling her toes, and there was a good motor block there. The sensory block persisted at T6. Now, what could be the reason for this? Anybody out there who could help us out with the diagnosis? Or do you want any investigation out there? Do you want to see the CT scan, or can you just hazard a guess? Nobody coming out? Okay, I'll show you the CT scan there. Is that clear? Can you see? No. क्या है? Subdural है? Subdural? What? What is that? Any guesses from the audience? So I think, Bhavani, I could ask you about this
Actually,
case?
this is my case. I was on call that day. And
It's interesting that, the slide said Pani et al. And I'll point out that the et al. is Kodali and Kamen.
So that's why I didn't put his name,
So I was on call, and at 1 o'clock, I just happened to be going on the floor, and they were trying to replace a catheter. So my fellow was replacing the catheter that was placed by the resident. So actually, they were trying to get a CSC they could not get. So he again put an epidural catheter. And as he was trying to replace it, I walked in. So I said, okay, let me have a shot at it. So I couldn't get a CSC, therefore I just threaded the catheter. We gave these, the usual 6 to 8 ml of 0.125. The patient became very comfortable. So I said everything is fine. The baby was delivered 1.5 hours later, and patient actually left the floor at 4 o'clock, 4 a.m. in the morning, 4 or 5 a.m. But what happened at 10 o'clock, we got a call, and I was post-call that day. That is important. I left the hospital at 8 o'clock, and Dr. Kamen came in. So the resident was called saying that the block was dense. So what happened was, they assessed the patient. There was a T10 sensory and almost very dense motor block. So naturally, they got worried. It is 6 hours already. So they got the CT scan, and they also got an MRI actually. Basically, what you see, those dark shadows, are the air in the epidural space and in the subcutaneous tissues there around. So what happened was, and this case was actually at the same time referred to the neurologist. And the neurologist came by and said that there is a lot of air there, and probably there is a spinal cord ischemia, although there was no evidence on the MRI or anything. So he suggested that the patient to go into the hyperbaric chamber. So this is around 4 o'clock when the preparations were being made, and I woke up from my usual post-call sleep and looked into these emails. There was a flurry of emails saying that patient has dense block. So I called Dr. Kamen. I said, look, this is what happened. Patient had more than usual dose of local anesthetic. She will probably recover, because the whole thing, the local anesthetic has to get absorbed, and therefore the patient will get recovery. However, we had a little bit of an issue. If a neurologist suggests that the patient should go to the hyperbaric chamber, it is better not to refuse that, because in case if the patient did not recover for any reason, it would be a major loss. So that is what Dr. Kamen told me. He said he concurs with me, but he would just let the patient go to the hyperbaric chamber.
So, just curious, can I survey the audience? If you knew that the epidural space was identified using loss of resistance to air, and then you got a CAT scan and showed air in the epidural space, would anybody be worried? Raise your hand if anyone is worried about that.
Are you worried about the air in that epidural space? We do not have hyperbaric chambers.
Nobody's worried about that. So the problem was, we got this particular neurologist was one who was an expert in diving medicine. So he deals with hyperbaric treatment all the time. So, of course, no matter what the problem is, the recommendation is going to be go to a hyperbaric chamber. So he sees this CAT scan and says, you got to go to a chamber. We all, both Dr. Kodali and myself, said, wait a minute. The epidural space was identified with loss of resistance to air. We intentionally put that stuff there. We know it's there. And we know it's going to be there. He said, oh, no, you got to go to a hyperbaric chamber. We said, no, it's intentional. And this went back and forth a few times. And eventually, just as Dr. Kodali said, the neurologist felt very strongly about this, even though we tried to educate him on epidural practices. And the patient went to a hyperbaric chamber and was in there for just a few minutes and then started to get claustrophobic. So they had to bring her out. And just around that time, she started getting better, which is probably consistent with the amount of time it took for residual local anesthetic to wear off. In other words, the hyperbaric treatment did nothing. It's just waiting a little bit more time, and she resolved. But I think the lesson here is nothing to do with air or prolonged block or any of those kind of things. The lesson here is that when we deal with consultants, especially neurologic consultants, because so many of our issues are neurologic consultants, it's important to have a neurologist who understands anesthetic issues. And I understand that not everybody has that, and in this case we didn't. We had one who absolutely was no clue about anesthesia issues, but it's so important that we have colleagues that understand our practices so we can have appropriate consultations.
Yeah, I
Well,
think that is the key. The key here is when you practice OB anesthesia, the complications you get, you should be conversant, and the neurologist also should know what are the, see, nowadays some neurologists are actually specializing in the complications of epidural, and they say no, this is not because of epidural. It is actually because it is because of the lumbosacral compression with the head coming down, etc. But this particular case, we did use, when I counted, 30 ml of air would have gone, because my resident tried 2-3 times, my fellow tried 2-3 times, and by the time I came, probably there was a lot of air, and I never realized that,
See, here, in your situation, you could get an MRI, you could get a CT scan. But many of our participants here, they work in peripheral hospitals, they are the solo practice people, do not have access to CT scan or MRIs. In that situation, what would be your message to
Actually, I think in this case, you're probably better off without a CT scan. Because if we, I'm serious. If you were in a remote area, no scanning available, what you would have done in a case like this is just wait a few more hours, and then she would have been fine. And so the worst thing that happened in this case was that she was in a tertiary care hospital with all these technologies. We should have just left her alone.
How many of you use air in your epidural space to identify? Yeah. And how many of you saline? Okay. Less of you use saline, more of you use air. So there's another interesting case which I think Dr. Ketan Parekh will talk about. He got a call from one of his colleagues. She was in distress, and Ketan and me discussed that case, so he'll come out with that case.
This friend of mine, she did an epidural on a patient, just a normal primey, 27, 28-year-old in labor. The epidural was performed in a sitting position using air to identify the space. And she obviously had a dural tap on the first go. So, as the practice is, she removed the needle and put the epidural on one space higher. And she managed to get the epidural. She put the catheter in, gave her normal loading dose, and patient became comfortable within 15-20 minutes. And in about half an hour's time, the patient started complaining of severe headache. So she got a little frightened, and she did an epidural blood patch on her in the space where she had done a dural tap. With the catheter in and patient being in labor.
So that's an unusual case.
Maybe I didn't hear it correctly. I want to make sure I understand. It was 30 minutes after the wet tap?
Yes.
She got a blood patch?
Yes. A wet tap done using air. Patient in labor. She did another epidural, put the catheter, got the patient comfortable with her epidural dose, and then patient complained of headache after half an hour. And a blood patch was done as a prophylactic blood patch that is kind of recommended by some people, which again is not fitting into this criteria, but that was the explanation given, that this was a prophylactic blood patch. Fortunately, patient went on having a normal delivery after about 6 hours or so, and nothing went wrong untowards. And I was actually told with a little this thing that, I did an epidural prophylactic blood patch and now patient is fine. And I was
First time in her career, I think she did a prophylactic blood patch. She was very happy about it.
Actually, now I remember this case. You emailed me. Yeah, that's right. He emailed me a couple of years ago about this case. He says, what you would have done? I said, well, I wouldn't have done anything at that time. And immediately he wrote to me what was done. And actually, I was very surprised. I said, of course, I raised my eyebrows. I thought, is it right or wrong? What is it? But I think in the end, I thought, I wouldn't have done it at least.
Yeah, what we're trying to not criticize somebody who's done it, but the reason I discussed this with the person who done it, and the argument was that there are so many papers which says that prophylactic blood patch is good, but what point was missed out that even those people who do prophylactic blood patch is done after the delivery when the block is completely worn off. You do not put a blood patch or inject the blood in the epidural space in a patient who already has an epidural catheter and is in labor. So that is just the point that we wanted to bring out here.
Yeah,
that
that's
yes,
the
I mean,
message
we're not
we
going
want
into
to send.
controversy of whether epidural blood patch prophylactic is good or should we wait for 24 hours and then do the blood patch when the symptoms don't recover with the conservative method. But the point is, do not have this misconcept about prophylactic blood patch being done as soon as the first pain or first headache occurs. Just to kind of ask, why would the patient get headache in 30 minutes? Anybody from the audience?
Yes, speak up. Yeah. What do you think the reason was? Air embolism?
Exactly. You're right, not embolism, but it's because air is being used to identify the space, air going into the CSF and, pneumoencephalus will give a pain in half an hour and which would settle down within, 20 minutes, half an hour, depending on the amount of air being injected. And probably it could have been tackled with simple Panadol or paracetamol or some kind of a thing rather than... So, not to criticize what was done, but to learn from that and to kind of clear the doubts that this is a misconception that a prophylactic blood patch is kind of done in this way.
I think one thing is we should all learn to put the catheter intrathecally if this happens in our practice. It's far simpler to deal with an intrathecal catheter and then, use the intrathecal for the rest of the labor. Because when you resite it in another space, you're not sure that you won't puncture the dura there again, or it may not be in the epidural at all. So I think that's the current guideline everywhere, to site the catheter intrathecally. And then when you take it out, in fact some people leave it, Bhavani used to tell me, leave the catheter for 24 hours, which we do now. And we think that's working very well. Leave the catheter in situ after the delivery is over for 24 hours.
Yeah, only issue on that is, not everybody here would be comfortable dealing with
Sure.
an intrathecal catheter.
No,
so
I'm
it
just
cannot be going as a final guidelines, but this is a better option than taking the needle out.
No, and also it's appalling that someone gave blood with a catheter in situ. What if the blood clot prevented the catheter from coming out? It's absolutely ridiculous.
Advantage of the intrathecal catheter as well. It also reduces the incidence of post-dural puncture headache. So that's the other advantage as well. So that's
But
helpful.
provided you can maintain good aseptic techniques.
Yeah.
That is really, it should be underlined.
And I think the other point as well is if you use less of air generally and use saline for your loss of resistance technique, that would also perhaps prevent this 30-minute headache as well. But having said that, use of saline is better because you get less post-dural, less dural puncture. So, although of course that's US, UK, I was a bit worried about us talking about it. But Bill says that he uses saline. So
we exclusively use, at least we teach our residents to use
Yeah.
But not everyone does what the teacher teaches. But we emphasize that
on the dais there's more saline.
More saline,
but with regard to
and
the-
there it is more of air.
With regard to the comment about the intrathecal catheters, that's the way we practice as well. When we have a wet tap, we place the intrathecal catheter. And another point about siting it at another interspace with an epidural is that even if you perfectly properly place an epidural at another interspace very rapidly and efficiently, you've still got an epidural catheter which is sitting near a dural puncture. So some of the medication in the epidural space can trickle across and go into the subarachnoid space, and these are typically cases where the block becomes more extensive than you might expect, or in some cases that catheter can migrate and become an intrathecal catheter. So you have to use exquisite vigilance with that epidural catheter because you never know, is it going to behave like a perfect epidural catheter? Is it going to behave like half spinal, half epidural? Or is it going to migrate and become a spinal? You just never know. Whereas if you place an intentional intrathecal catheter when you get the wet tap, now you know where it is. You know it's intrathecal, and you give the appropriate doses for intrathecal, and you don't have to worry about anything.
See, I had one more worry about that patient. Whenever you do blood patches, you inject blood, some amount of blood can actually get into the CSF, and patient can get back pain. In fact, I tell the patients that you will get back pain, but it will go away. As long as you are mobile, your back pain will go away because of some chemical irritation by the blood. So I was worried about this patient when he emailed me. I said, if she got back pain when she is in labor, what would one do? So that is why I put all this together. I said, no, I won't do it. But of course, then he gave me the answer afterwards.
And this is another case scenario published in IJO in 2010. This was a primary case, and she requested for epidural labor analgesia. 14 ml of 0.25% bupivacaine along with epinephrine was given in this patient, and she had a good sensory analgesia from T8 to L4. She had mild hypotension, which of course they infused some fluids and got over it. After 3 hours, she requested a top-up, and they gave her 12 ml of the same dose. And after 15 minutes, she had some amount of hypotension again, 90 by 50. Again, infused fluids and gave her a dose of ephedrine. After 25 minutes, they find that there is numbness right up to the clavicle, heaviness in the left arm, both legs, chest, perineum, numbness to pinprick. On one side, it was right up to C3, and the other side, it was T2. The respiration was somewhat uncoordinated, and with your infusions and vasopressor, they could maintain the BP at 130 by 80. And after 4 hours, the block regressed. The patient was fine. Now, why did this hypotension occur? Why this irregular analgesia in this patient?
I am always wondering why this for labor analgesia such a high concentration of the medication is used. We never use 0.25 or even 0.125 also we won't use. We are using 0.0625% or 0.05%. So such a low concentration, high volume we are using. Always here it is being shown as 0.25%, which is quite misleading.
Right. So and this was, the reason is because this was published in 2010. It's a collection of case reports where he really wanted to show what could be the complications which could occur. Maybe that is the reason this high concentration is being used. Otherwise, I don't think in US and UK you use 0.25%.
No, not now. I mean, probably
an old case reports which have come up.
It's a very old case. Otherwise, recent past, I don't think anybody is using 0.25 for labor analgesia. It's not even 0.125%. It's only 0.0625%.
Yeah.
0.0. Thank you.
Yes, what could be the reason for this? It could be a subdural. Okay. So then, you can see the typical picture of subdural block. Could you explain this? What is so typical about this? They say that you could really diagnose a subdural block by the picture you see on these radiological pictures. Kajal, could you?
It's a railroad picture.
Yeah, it's a railroad track, they say. These two are quite diagnostics. So this is a view of the thoracolumbar spine showing a mass of intradural contrast at L3S1, and here you can see the railroad tracks. So this is a high subdural block. Now, Dr. Ketan, Dr. Purva, what could be the difference from a total spinal block when you see a subdural block?
You have disproportionately high sensory block, and the patient will still be complaining of pain. I think occasionally it can, you can also go up to the face, because we had a patient who had weakness. I think it came with Horner syndrome as well, so it can go very high up as well. You can have hemodynamic changes.
So hemodynamic changes we could find in a total spinal block also.
Yes.
Maybe the severity would not be so
higher
right?
in total spinal rather than
it will be more catastrophic as opposed to.
It will be more hypertension, I would say. In a that's right.
Yeah, and maybe with some respiratory compromise in a total spinal block. Otherwise, here I don't think they would land up with much of respiratory compromise, except for some uncoordinated respiratory movements.
I have seen one case where we had to intubate for a subdural block.
For a subdural
Not for
block.
a pregnant patient, but I was in another theatre and this colleague came to me. She had done an epidural for TUR, and after 30 minutes of waiting, she said the patient, they started off with the procedure and patient was still uncomfortable. So she was still struggling to kind of see whether epidural would work and was waiting. Meanwhile, patient suddenly sort of became hypotensive and stopped breathing, though had good motor power. So then she had to intubate her and maintain the blood pressure with vasopressors. And in about 45 minutes to 1 hour, she'd fortunately given only lignocaine because it was a quick procedure. In 45 to 1 hour time, patient absolutely completely recovered.
Okay. Actually, I don't know if there are any postgraduates here, but one thing is...
there are a lot of postgraduates around.
The subarachnoid space and subdural space, they communicate intracranially. Epidural space does not communicate. It just stops around the foramen magnum. So it is very unusual if you inject massive amount of medication into the epidural space to lose the consciousness. The patient will lose consciousness only when they become hypoxic, when we're not taking care of the respiration. Whereas in the subdural and subarachnoid, the chances are it could happen depending upon the amount of local anesthetic given. That is why, that explains his example of the case.
Yeah. So this is an interesting picture I got from Dr. Steiner, electron microscopic picture. And here what you see is the intradural bulge of the local anesthetic. It could go into the epidural space along the catheter. It could go into the subdural space, and it could go into the arachnoid space.
Yeah, this is very interesting diagram.
Yeah.
What I was trying to say yesterday in the workshop, we've been telling everybody about, diagnosing the subdural block. And if you don't pick up, what would happen is that you keep injecting more and more volume, and effectively arachnoid being very flimsy membrane compared to dura, you will have rupture of arachnoid and pushing a large volume intrathecally, and that could lead to a sudden cardiovascular as well as respiratory collapse and loss of consciousness. So that is something that one has to be very careful when dealing with the subdural block.
Normally, Dr. Kemen, we do not enter the subdural space. But why does it occur in some patients that you manage to enter the subdural space, you create so many problems for your patient?
That's a good question, and I'm going to admit I don't think anyone has an answer. This happens sometimes infrequently when we're doing epidurals, but I don't think anybody knows why. Is there an anatomical defect that allows this to happen in certain patients, or is it just one of those things that happens? Honestly, I don't know. Does anyone else know what predisposes a patient to getting a subdural catheter? I don't think it's known.
I think it's still a gray field.
Two things. The dura is not like, in the subarachnoid, they are not like a cylinder. It means you cannot actually identify those layers like one cylinder inside the other cylinder. The dura can be extremely close to the to the ligamentum flavum. In some case, actually it keeps waving like this. So that is why sometimes some people say, if you put the epidural needle, you can actually put a kink in the dura. And most of the times we get away. But suppose if you make a small neck, which is not sufficient enough to go into the subarachnoid membrane yet, and the catheter can simply go through that. It's a rare thing. That is why it can happen.
I believe it just slides into the subdural space.
Right. So I'm curious to know, does anyone know they use saline or air in this case?
It is air they have used in this case.
This loss of resistance to air.
Yeah, loss of resistance was with air. Then we go on to the third case scenario. A primipara, 26-year-old, 38 weeks gestation, in active labor, requests an epidural analgesia. 0.125% bupivacaine. I hope you are a bit happy now. The concentration is coming down. Still it is high, right? 16 ml. She has a patchy analgesia and a numb left leg. 80 minutes later, they decide the patient has fetal distress, and she goes in for an emergency cesarean delivery. 10 ml, 2% lignocaine with epinephrine. After 3 minutes, they were very cautious. They did a negative aspiration. Again, another dose of 10 ml, 2% lignocaine was given. And then she went into severe hypotension and apnea. Can't hear you. Stand up and... Yeah, you're right. Just tell us. What is that?
Accidental dural puncture, and it has gone into a total spinal.
Accidental dural
large
puncture.
Large volume of epidural.
Yes. She has a total spinal block now. So then the patient resuscitated, converted to GA. recovered after 3 hours, and the block regresses after 6 hours. Now, in a total spinal, supposing she was not on the operating table, she was still on the labor analgesia floor. Dr. Ketan, how would you manage this patient? In your Breach Candy Hospital, how would you manage this patient? She is not going in for cesarean
See, the
delivery.
thing is, two things here. Number one, if she was not going to go for cesarean,
Yeah,
I probably
she
wouldn't
is.
have used the 2% lignocaine.
Yes, yes,
Anyway,
but she had a top-up.
I use even less than that. So probably this would not have occurred if she was not going to go for cesarean.
Yes.
But what I just said earlier, this could still occur if the previous dose, we don't have any
At
cardiovascular.
0.1 to 5%.
No, we don't have any cardiovascular readings on that. But if what I was saying earlier, if this kind of thing was a subdural thing with a patchy numbness and little iffy block, with the second dose, if the arachnoid is ruptured,
Yes.
then you could have a total spinal. So that could be an explanation for what might have happened, or a catheter migration, which is known. As I said, if she was in labor, this would not have happened because the type of low-dose mixture that we use are pretty much safe from sudden cardiovascular or neurological collapses. But just to kind of get my back right near the wall, if suppose this was to happen, then obviously we've all gone through Dr. Anju's lecture in the morning, where we have to kind of be prepared. So what yesterday, I think Dr. Keman and Dr. Bhavani both of them said in the morning about their preparation of the, in the place where you do an epidural, you have to have a resuscitation equipment handy, and you should be prepared to immediately start the resuscitation and intubate and get the patients going.
Anything else? Any specific drugs you want to remove that bupivacaine there? That cardiotoxic bupivacaine?
See, here it's lignocaine, so I wouldn't want to use intralipid.
bupivacaine.
But if suppose it was with bupivacaine, then intralipid is what is been now recommended strongly to reverse the effect of bupivacaine on the...
Dr. Kodali, do you use intralipid?
Yeah, actually we
In
do
your
have
cases?
them in the stock. No,
Okay.
actually we did have an unfortunate case. Well, actually, I mean, she recovered completely. They did a popliteal block with bupivacaine, and patient went into cardiac arrest, VFib, and CPR was continued. It was 6:45 in the morning. So the cardiac OR did not get their scheduled patient yet into the room. So they took the patient, and patient went on to bypass. And then, of course, after a while, she recovered. So then, of course, at the time, intralipid was not was not recognized its use. But now it is a standard. We do have it on the OB floor. We do have it wherever we do actually regionals. And in OB, in obstetric practice, the type of the local anesthetic we use, the concentration and the volume, it's very, very unlikely to get cardiovascular toxicity.
Yeah, I have a question, ma'am. Regarding this case, okay. Suppose this patient, what yesterday we were talking in the labor analgesia workshop, suppose the patient is in labor room and severe fetal distress, immediate cesarean section has to be done. So to prepare it so that by the time the patient reaches the OT table, you give 10 ml of lignocaine 2% with soda bicarb, so that by the time the patient reaches the OT table, there is at least enough analgesia for the incision to be given. Considering this case, suppose this patient had an epidural catheter, was on labor analgesia. It was decided that give the drug for this cesarean section, and accidentally it was an migrated intrathecal catheter. So the patient went into these all sort of problems. So when should we give? When should we give that dose? Suppose while transportation we have the same problem. We have given the drug. While transportation, no one is besides the patient. The patient is being transported, and if this can happen, it is a catastrophic. Yeah. So when that dose should be given? In the labor room or in the OT table?
Can I just...
That's a very interesting...
can answer that, because I know the setup here is different, but one of the recommendations from the last confidential inquiries, the latest one which is published this year in the UK, is that we we had, out of the deaths, the anesthetic deaths we had, 2 of them were deaths from failed intubation in grade 1 cesarean section. Both had working epidurals in labor. The anesthetist decided that they would transfer the patient into theatre because initially it wasn't grade 1, it was grade 2. So he thought he'll have enough time to top up the epidural in theatre, so he shifted the patient from the labor ward to theatre. In theatre, they suddenly decided to change it from a grade 2 to grade 1. So he did not have time to top up the epidural. He had a failed intubation, and the patient died. And the other patient as well as a similar story. The recommendation now is that we should top up all working epidurals, preferably in the room, and then transfer the patient. Now, if you have time, I mean, if it works, then you're lucky. You get away with it. You don't have to do that unnecessary GA. But the problem is, I know in this country we don't have adequate monitoring. But having said that, you still have the problem even in the UK. I mean, we top up all our epidurals in the room, and we had a total spinal. We had exactly this sort of a case. I was on call that night. I was doing another epidural when my registrar topped up the epidural, and there was a huge commotion on the ward. And I just finished my epidural. I put my head out, and people were running all over the place. And he had just given the top-up, and the patient had a respiratory arrest. It didn't take us long. We just put a mask, the ambu bag on. Within 1.5 minutes, we were in theatre. Patient was intubated. All the monitoring was on. So the advice is that top it up in the room, but be aware that you're going to have a problem. And if possible, take all your monitoring from the room with you onto the theatre. So our own recommendation is do it in the labor ward.
I just want to add to that. We also do the same thing. We top it up in the labor room. If those of you who were at my lecture earlier today when I was discussing the article, why obstetric anesthesiologists get sued, and we had a whole list of reasons. And one of the reasons, which included 4 cases in that particular series, was just because of this event, a total spinal occurred in the labor room, but resuscitation equipment was not available. It was only in the operating room, so someone had to go and get it, which caused a delay in resuscitating the patient. So while labor rooms are not set up with the same kind of anesthetic equipment as we have in the operating room, they should always be set up with at least equipment to manage or control the airway, ambu bag and things of that nature, so you can at least make the initial efforts.
The take-home message would be,
Exactly. I just want to kind of...
This patient developed a total spinal after 10 ml of 2% xylocaine. And the patient already having analgesia in the lower limb. So the patient already is painless. So general anesthesia, supplementation is full-fledged general anesthesia is not required. The patient requires the resuscitation first. He develops bradycardia, hypotension, apnea, and we have to maintain the vital functions, and simultaneously we have to proceed with the surgery without general anesthesia. The patient, if at all the patient is having any sensation, we can supplement with mild dose of midazolam or something. The full-fledged general anesthesia is not required in this stage case. That's what I feel.
I think the issue here is not general anesthesia. The issue is airway control.
Yeah. Yes, doctor.
See, this question of giving top-up dose or initial dose in the labor room is concerned. Before I start my talk, I just want to say that I don't practice the way you all practice, because most of you practice in a big institute. Whereas I practice in a very small nursing homes. I'm a freelance anesthetist. So our scenario is totally different. As he said that you should talk with Indian scenario keeping in mind, I would go one step further, that you should talk not only with Indian scenario, but you should also talk with the people like me who practice in a small nursing home in periphery. So what I have done is that my rule is that I never give epidural in labor room, because I don't trust labor room's aseptic precautions. So invariably I put down my foot and I always give my epidural in the operation theatre. That is number one. And number two is that every time I give top-up dose for next 15 minutes, I do not leave my patients, but I remain by the side of the patient. This is to be for extra precautions because there is no helping hand in our scenario. I am the boss and I am the ward boy. So people who are practicing like me should keep this thing in mind. That do not take any chance. Do not give epidurals in labor room because you really don't know what is the aseptic precautions there. And second thing, whenever you give second dose, please take care. Do not leave the patient. If you don't leave the patient, such scenario will never come into picture.
You're absolutely right because in labor room of the kind of the place you're talking about are also not equipped with resuscitative equipment.
Yeah, so I hope the take-home message is very loud and clear. As opposed to what Dr. Subramaniam is working in, high-tech area where you can take all the risks, but in a place like Mumbai, in small nursing homes, you need to be very, very careful. So Dr. Subra, do you want to add something on to that?
Can I just go one step further and say if you're not comfortable with your setup, why should you do an epidural there at all? You know, if you're not in the hospital,
that is exactly the question I have.
You're not in the hospital, you want to put an epidural, go home, don't do an epidural. I mean, patient is not going to die for lack of an epidural.
So this is a nursing home actually, basically
yes,
what
so
he's
in a nursing
about.
home, why do an epidural?
No, he's not scared
in the
of the
OT.
If you are round the clock in the hospital, then it doesn't matter labor ward or theatre as long as the resus equipment is next to you.
Regarding asepsis, he's talking about
asepsis is one point, but we are talking of resuscitative ability here.
Subbu, 1 second.
Which is not available in the labor wards, you know.
Hello.
Well, you can
so
always make it available.
Better to go in.
As Dr. Keman said, all you need is a tube and an ambu bag. That can be there anywhere. You don't need a big resus equipment.
Yes. So the message I think is well taken. Those who are comfortable, please give it in the labor OT, and those who have high-tech places, please give it in your labor room.
Yeah, but that doesn't answer the actual question. What you are saying is where to give the epidural.
Yes, because
the question is where to give the top-up for an emergency cesarean.
Where
so we are
to
actually
give,
we did not yet answer that gentleman's
from
question
that point.
Because he wants to know where to give the top-up in the scenario
in
that they working it, and I personally working in Bombay do not give it in the labor room.
It should always be in the
We always give it in the theatre. What Dr. Purva said, the surgeon suddenly changed their criteria from grade 2 to grade 1. It is obstetrician's problem, okay? Because they have that different kind of. There are very, very few incidences where grade 1 cesarean section is actually indicated, and the emergency nature is really very rare. And there is always 30 minutes time from the time the decision is made to get the baby out. If you are on site with the patient and if you wheel the patient in immediately, again in the UK I know they use bupivacaine to top up their epidural, we use lignocaine. If you use lignocaine, within 10 minutes, 5 to 7 minutes you can get a good block and there is no delay at all if your epidural is in the right place. So I personally will not use it, you give the top up in the delivery room. I would take the patient on the OT, have the monitor. Of course I will not wait for the monitor to be put and check. Once I'm in the OT, I'll start putting my drugs while the simultaneous blood pressure reading and monitoring is being taken care so that I don't waste time in, doing other things. But I would be in a better setup before I give the top.
The organizers, I think the time is over. Can we overstep? Is there something else here?
It's okay, we can continue.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I just have one comment to make. I was trained here. I worked here. But there are certain things which I plead, I make a plea to each of you. Instead of telling that we don't have, do you make enough efforts to improve the standard of care? That is what I'm trying to, put forward. See, you said there is no ambu bag, there is no endotracheal, but these are the minimum requirements which as an anesthesiologist, as a group in your hospital, must bring it to the attention of the administration and try to, because the Indian Society of Anesthesiologists is not going to, dictate how we should be practicing. This change has to come from you, and all of us have to make some effort and say that these are the minimum things to maintain a standard to avoid, future complications. I think that is where that hurts me actually. That is why I have to make this, this statement.
Yeah, can I applaud what you're saying? Because I come to India almost every year and I give some sort of similar talk like this. And every time we say something new, the answer I get is, oh, it is fine, it will work for you in UK, it won't work here. And a simple point, I've worked like you in Vizag in 1995. I did the first labor epidural in Vizag, and I used to stay in the hospital till the patient delivered. And all the other anesthetists used to laugh at me. They used to say, what are you getting paid for it? We could do 5 or 6 cases all at the same time. But I used to stay there physically. But I just wanted to make a small point. The question is, you need to have good resuscitation facilities on any ward. You're having a patient there, even if they're only laboring. Resus facilities is a standard, it's a basic right of every patient. So whether you're putting in an epidural or you're not putting in an epidural, you should expect a certain level of care. So maybe we should try and improve the level of care we give patients, even normally on the ward, whether they're obstetric or non-obstetric.
The point well taken. I think we would go on to another scenario. Otherwise, we would be stuck here. Okay.
This is to Madam
You have
and Dr.
touched
Bhavani.
the raw chord there.
I think both of you have a very wrong impression that things are not improving in India. I can tell you every day, whatever thing was there yesterday, today is definitely better. We are equally responsible and we know our knowledge and we know that resuscitation things should be kept ready, and every sensible anesthetist does that thing. So don't go under wrong impression that in India we don't improve or we don't try to improve or things like that. No,
I think you're misunderstanding my point.
I have been practicing for more than 35 years. Absolutely. And I know what I was doing 35 years back. Yeah. I know what I am doing today. Yeah. And there is a tremendous difference.
You're absolutely
right.
Please
don't get that impression.
I'm not querying. What I'm trying to say, you as a senior person must instill this to the juniors, saying that we should try to get what is necessary before we do certain procedures. And that is the way we should be teaching our juniors and our postgraduates. That is the point I'm trying to make.
Okay, Dr. Ravindra, you wanted to say something there?
See, I come from a very, very small place. And I have started practicing labor analgesia about 5 or 6 years ago.
He is the head of anesthesia in a medical college.
Yeah, I am the head of the department of anesthesiology in a medical college, but I practice my labor analgesia in a private setup out of the hospital hours, and I have formed a group and I practice. So I started practicing in a very small place, but even in that small place, when I wanted it, I could get even a Boyle's apparatus in the labor room before I could get place an epidural catheter.
That is the role model. That is what I'm trying to say.
I think if we want to improve our standards, we can always do it. See, a labor room can have all resuscitative measures. It just does not take anything much. Even one small, simple pulse oximeter, a fingertip pulse oximeter is available at 5,000 rupees, 3,000 rupees. A Boyle's apparatus is available at 45,000 rupees. I don't think it's difficult. I think we should have a mind to improve.
Yes.
I think
the point is well taken here, and both the panelists and the audience agree with you. So we go on to our next case, and this case is a 24-year-old. The epidural catheter was inserted at L3-4, and it was inserted too far in. Then they decided that we should pull it back a bit so that only 4 to 5 centimeters is left there. But trying to pull it out, it broke, and what they did was the patient was very adamant, I need labor analgesia and I want to go in for a labor epidural. So they inserted another catheter in a different place. It was a successful labor analgesia. She delivered painlessly, and now they advised her that there is a broken fragment there. She had moderate low right-sided back pain. And when they looked at the CT scan, here can you appreciate the broken epidural catheter? L2-3 disc right up to the T12 pedicles. Now in this situation, what would you like to do? Would you like to advise the patient if she has no neurological problems? What would you like to do if she had right lumbar pain and the leg on one side? What would you advise her? Anybody from the audience right there? Have you faced a situation like this? Any of you? Any time have you faced a broken epidural catheter? Hands up. Oh, 3 of you. Dr. Tarlika.
Not in a pregnant lady.
Okay. Laboring epidural, anybody has faced this? Yes, ma'am. Could you tell us something about that? What did you do about it?
It was while removing the catheter, like after the patient delivered, and I was removing. While removing, it was just probably a half centimeter or 1 centimeter of the catheter that remained behind.
Okay.
It did give me palpitations. I did call up 1 or 2 seniors, and they said, forget it about it. If there is no problem, I don't think you should worry about it.
Did you corroborate with any radiological findings where the catheter was lying or something?
No.
Okay.
I mean, it was
so you just left the patient and she's happy?
It was many years back, and I was just fresh into my private practice.
The patient has not come back to you?
No.
Yeah.
So I don't know exactly, but I'm definite that she didn't have any problems. Otherwise,
she would definitely have
I would definitely know
hold of your
about
neck,
it.
right?
Yeah.
Okay. Any comments? Shearing occurs, right? Okay. So what do you do if you face such a situation? But what would you do? No, once you have, your resident has done it and this catheter is lying in there, this broken piece is there.
Yeah. No problem.
How would you advise, means how would you counsel your patient, you know? They can be really belligerent. Okay. 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 Okay.
I think this is very,
good
advice.
More situation, please.
I want to follow up exactly on this point, so please let me follow up on this point.
Okay.
We should get neurosurgical consultation exactly because of what you said. You're 100% correct. We don't want to take the blame for this in terms of making the decision. The neurosurgeon should be consulted immediately, and we should do what they say. Now, having said that, what they almost always say is don't go get the catheter. Just leave it in. It's an inert foreign body, causes no problem. Just leave it in. But you're absolutely correct. Get a consultation. Don't take this on ourselves. Get a consultation and do what they say.
Okay. Any other comment on this? Anything else you want to? How would you, Dr. Kodali, how would you prevent this catastrophe, a broken epidural catheter?
I mean, so what happens
and
is
before
this.
that, could I ask you, what are the situations where, in this situation, you would definitely like intervention, surgical intervention to remove it? You would not like to keep this catheter in.
So actually we had one patient where the catheter never came out. It just wouldn't come out. You know, in fact, what Dr. Kamen suggested in the morning, give some saline. It was tried. And also, when the catheters don't come out, you have the patient change the position. Sometimes, you know, flexion, forwards, backwards, and then try to pull, it'll come off. But in that particular patient, when the CT scans were done, the catheter actually knotted around the pedicle. And so there was no way that the catheter was going to come. So yeah.
That was a stuck catheter.
Yeah.
We will come to that later. This is a broken catheter.
No, as I said, I mean, for a broken catheter, if the neurosurgeon says just leave it, we just leave it. Okay. And there is nothing, I mean, no intervention is required actually. I mean, touch wood, we didn't have a broken catheter, but...
so even this broken catheter, when would you like to remove it? The neurosurgeon?
Unless the patient has got symptoms.
Symptoms. Yeah.
And then, of course, as I said, and as he said, and as Dr. Kamen said, it is probably between the neurosurgeon decision whether that catheter is, those symptoms are because of that catheter. And leaving the catheter and then having some reaction around it is going to produce some problems in the future.
Some granulomas or something.
Exactly, because to do a surgery, it is not a simple surgery here. And this is actually a major surgery. They probably have to, trace exactly, do even a laminectomy to get it out.
Yeah.
So it won't be that easy surgery too. Whereas the case which I was mentioning, it was easy. They just followed, it was pedicle, they just removed it from there.
Okay.
So,
Dr. Kajal?
I would say that if the catheter is not giving any trouble, then we can let it be, as everybody is saying. But if it is in intrathecal space, which is very rare, I think that needs to be taken out because of the risk of infection and, as you said, granuloma formation.
Yeah, it could act like a wick and, keep draining your CSF from there.
Just one comment on, just one more thing important, which I think is said but not said in clear word. Very important to communicate with the patient and document of what has been communicated because of the safety from the medico-legal problem in future. So whatever is documented and discussed with the patient should be documented. That is one thing. And one more thing I just, out of curiosity, want to ask everybody on the dais. If you have done an epidural, once the patient is delivered, who removes the catheter?
The anesthesiologist.
Very, very important question and a take-home message for all our audience
In our
here.
hospital, the midwife does it.
We have the
in our hospital residents.
Yeah.
And what about you, Dr. Kemen?
The reason
Resident?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the reason I'm saying is, I have to admit this. When I came back from the UK in '96, I used to wait till everything was over. See, when I say everything is over, patients deliver. After delivery, the placenta comes out. Then the surgeons or the obstetrician takes time to do the episiotomy. And different obstetricians have different, skill of doing the embroidery in that area. And they try to kind of take as much time as they take. And by the time, after 5-7 years of my practice, I thought I started becoming senior and got a little complacent. And decided to leave the removal of the catheter on the nurses on the ward. Of course, I kind of would rely on 4 or 5 senior nurses and I actually told them specifically to look for that blue tip when they take it out.
Till a couple of weeks back?
Till a couple of weeks back, when I got a phone call at 7 o'clock in the morning from Amritsar, and a gentleman told me that, sir, last night I put an epidural and I tried to remove it and I felt a snap and I left the catheter inside. What do I do? It's a different story what happened further on. But since then, I've gone back to taking out catheter myself. So the message I want to try and pass on is, please make sure that you remove your catheters and you look at the blue point at the tip.
The first attempt, they put it at L3-4, was not working. So on the second attempt, at L2-3 they put in. They had a slight amount of hypotension. And after 4 hours, the patient went in for cesarean delivery. Post-operatively, they tried removing the catheter and the catheter was stuck, just could not be removed. And you can see the picture here. Can you appreciate the stuck catheter, periosteal entrapment along the inferior vertebral body? So that was what he was talking about. Now, such a situation, how do you avoid this problem here? Like, how do we remove the catheter now? It's a stuck catheter. If I pull more, you're going to have a broken catheter on your hands.
Well, a few things. It sort of was already mentioned. You can put the patient back in the position they're in during the placement of the epidural. You can inject some saline into the epidural catheter, pulling as you're injecting to maybe make some stiffness of the catheter by the injection of saline. That usually works. But if none of these things work, then don't panic. Just put some tape back on the back, wait a few more hours, just leave it alone. And most of the time, if you come back 3 or 4 hours later, the catheter just slips right out. And if it doesn't, wait a few more hours. Remember, patients can keep these in the rest of their lives. So it's certainly okay to keep it in for 3, 4, 5, 6 hours. Just wait a few more hours, try it again. And almost all the time, with the patient moving around, it might have been stuck up against a little bone spur or something like that. They move around in bed, it just loosens itself up, and after 3 or 4 hours, it just comes out by itself.
You know what this reminds me, I'm sure all of us would know. When you're flying a kite, if a kite gets stuck, you don't keep pulling at it. You just leave it little bit, and sometimes it gets...
That's exactly right.
So do you know what happened in this case? They called in a neurosurgeon. They wanted the neurosurgeon to remove this catheter. And what he did was, he put in an artery forceps, a hemostat, close to the skin and one lower down, just left it. He said, forget about this patient. Next day morning they came and they found the catheter was out. So that is how the neurosurgeon removed it. That was some place in UK, you see. I have an unusual question, which is very interesting. Can I ask? Regarding this, Dr. Kamdar?
This is regarding anesthesia, not regarding this topic.
Okay, we'll do that at the end. Just let me do one more case report, then we'll do.
Sure.
Now, combined spinal epidurals for labor analgesia, you find that there is fetal bradycardia and the obstetrician is very unhappy. She decides for a cesarean section. Dr. Purva, could you say something about this? CSC for labor analgesia with opioids, intrathecal opioid and bupivacaine maybe.
Okay,
so the patient lands up with fetal bradycardia.
The patient has received CSC.
For labor analgesia, yeah.
Yeah, and that's fetal bradycardia. Was, one of the things in Hull we don't do CSCs.
Okay.
But one of the things we don't do is, this fetal bradycardia comes soon after the CSC was...
With intrathecal opioid?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The problem with fetal bradycardia appearing soon after CSC is sometimes you're not quite sure whether it's because of the CSC per se, rather than just being a factor other than the CSC, purely because you've given the...
Because it's, I think, profound analgesia,
yeah,
which
that's
occurs.
correct. Yeah, and the fact that you've also, you've removed the sympathetic drive goes, and therefore you get your fetal bradycardia.
Yeah, there's some imbalance.
Yeah. So what was your question, sorry?
Can you avoid this fetal bradycardia? Do you want this CSC technique to be changed?
Yeah. What we have done
the
in
drugs you are using intrathecally, can you avoid your opioid and just give your plain local analgesics there?
What we have done in Hull is, because we do have trainees coming from other parts who want to do CSC, we have a rule which says that if the patient, we avoid CSC for a certain group of patients who we think might be at higher risk of getting the fetal brady. And they are, if they have a history of previous cesarean section, if there is a history of fetal distress, previously settled fetal distress, or if the labor is not progressing normally, we don't advise CSC and we do only an epidural. And that's why we also end up having a very high epidural rate and a very low CSC rate.
Okay. Maybe, Dr. Kodali, could you expand on this?
So normally we don't do CSCs if there's a fetal heart rate variability. So we just avoid CSC because CSCs are known to produce bradycardia in certain circumstances. Although when they did a control studies, there was no difference between epidural and CSCs. But in practice, we do see fetal bradycardia, and most likely it is because of the imbalance between the epinephrine and norepinephrine, producing uterine hypertonia. And sometimes we do give ephedrine thinking that the uterine flow is also decreased, and that can bring up the blood pressure and better fetal perfusion. Sometimes they use terbutaline, subcutaneous terbutaline, because they feel their hand on the uterus or they look at the fetal heart, the uterine contraction on the monitor. If they feel it is hypertonicity is there, they use actually terbutaline. And in some cases, you have to go for urgent cesarean section. Our setup would be a little different from here because we do have chloroprocaine, and chloroprocaine is not available in India. So you have only two options, give lidocaine and hopefully the CSC analgesia, which produces and would be good enough for the start, and then the lidocaine may kick in as it progresses. Otherwise, we have to just go for a general anesthesia.
There was another article recently which talked about avoiding intrathecal opioid in this situation. Just give your plain bupivacaine, and then within half hour, you can run an epidural infusion of your opioid plus local anesthetic.
Here's the thing about that, though, is that it's not really definite that it's the opioid that's causing the problem. Bhavani said, it's the rapid onset of the analgesia which causes the imbalance in catecholamines, and you'll get this rapid onset of anesthesia whether you use local anesthetic alone or local anesthetic with opioid. So the issue is not avoid opioid, the issue is avoid CSE in this situation. So as was already mentioned, there's no question there's an association between CSE and fetal bradycardia. Just as we said, we don't do it at all in patients that already have a pre-existing fetal heart rate abnormality, but you can get this in patients that were perfectly fine until then. It's really hard to prevent by altering your drugs, like taking the opioid out. That won't prevent the occurrence of this.
Now, this is an interesting case.
Can I just add something to that?
Yes,
what
sure.
we do in that situation is, if we did do the CSE, all we do is we calm the obstetricians down and we ask them to do nothing, and usually it settles. By the time they make the decision to do a C-section and start moving the patient towards theatre, everything is settled.
Yeah, sure.
Most of these CSE-related bradycardias are transient bradycardias, and within 20-25 minutes you should recover.
Yeah. This is an interesting case which Dr. Kemen had mailed me about, and he discussed it in his case of workshop yesterday in labor analgesia. Have anybody from the audience heard about this case? Okay, only a few hands are raised. So Dr. Kemen, could you elaborate on this case?
This is a very tragic and famous case that happened in Australia a couple of years ago. It's been all over the news. Some of you who might have been at the workshops yesterday, we were discussing this. You can read about it online. There's nothing secret about this case. We know the patient's name. The patient's name is Grace Wong. You can look it up. There's a Facebook page dedicated to support of this patient and her tragic problems. It's totally open case. What happened here was that anesthesiologist was placing an epidural and got a bloody tap. So took the catheter out and went to replace at another space. At the second space, got an intrathecal catheter. Left the catheter as intrathecal. Went to give local anesthetic. There was a basin on the epidural tray of a pink-colored solution. The anesthesiologist thought this was the local anesthetic that had become a little bit pink from a drop of blood from the bloody tap. So they drew it up and injected it intrathecally. What it actually was the chlorhexidine skin antiseptic. The result was chronic permanent paralysis. It's been about 3 years now. The patient is permanently paralyzed and has chronic arachnoiditis as well. So not only is she paralyzed, but is in pain constantly. So a horrible, tragic outcome, and several lessons from this case. One of the lessons that we always emphasize this with our own practice is prep the back and then get all the prep solution off your tray. Don't have any prep solution around. Do the prep first, and everything off the tray. Don't leave anything around there. And that's probably the primary error that happened in this particular tragic case. So. Again, you can read about it. The patient's name is Grace Wong. She's been on TV. There was a TV show just about a month ago or so. You can actually access it online where the patient was interviewed describing her whole circumstances. That's pretty much what happened here. So we know that chlorhexidine is neurotoxic when injected intrathecally. Then again, so is betadine. But this would really never happen with betadine because betadine is so darkly colored, no one would confuse betadine for anything. Whereas chlorhexidine being a light pink, you could easily confuse it for maybe that you could ask then, well, should the anesthesiologist have injected local anesthetic that has a drop of blood in it? Probably, if it truly was blood, it probably wouldn't do anything, but we probably shouldn't be doing that anyway. But nonetheless, you can see how the coloring of the solution allowed this problem to happen. So that's the case.
Now, before we conclude, we have this interesting poster from Purva. I would like her to expand on this from the National Patient Safety Agency.
I think when we were having this email discussion around this case, it also highlighted the fact that you could have the same issue with wrong drug injection. What has become now, well, it's being forced upon us, but I think we are all beginning to see the usefulness of this approach. It's a double-checking approach. It looks very complicated, But essentially, what the National Patient Safety Agency in the UK has now asked all of us to do is to do double checking of all our drugs. So I know we're incredibly irritated about it, because if you have, I know it's not possible in all situations for anesthetists, but now it has become mandatory that at induction, we should double check all the drugs we draw up, not just our opiates, but your induction agents, everything. Basically, it is you call out the drug that you have drawn, the other person checks it, and then the other person also records what you have heard, and then double checks it with you before you actually administer the drug. So basically, it's as simple as that, but it's just that it looks a lot more complicated. And it's just not for anesthetists, it's for all specialities, and it's right across the hospital and in the community as well.
Yes, that's why I put up this poster. It's really appropriate for the case report that came up. Dr. Kamdar, you wanted to talk about some case?
No, this is not about the case.
Okay.
See, in all these years of my practice, I do my pre-operative evaluation of the patient and ask the history and all. And all these years, so many people have asked me so many questions which I could answer. But of late, one lady asked me, she was undergoing some surgery, repair of hernia, and she had also undergone surgery, 5 to 6 times surgery before that under general anesthesia. A very intelligent and English-speaking lady, what she asked me, doctor, can you tell me whether this multiple general anesthesia can lead me to an Alzheimer in my future? So I did not know how to answer this. If anybody can have any answer, or if these people have any answer, how do we answer these questions?
Yes, Dr.
Is general anesthesia...
So this is a very interesting question. And so there's... let me take the other extreme, the infant. There's a lot of suggestive research now about neurodevelopmental delays related to exposure to various general anesthetic agents. We'll have a lecture tomorrow by my colleague, Dr. Arvind Palanisamy, on this very issue with regard to neonatal exposure. Now, you're talking at the end of life. There's a whole separate set of research there on the so-called POCD, post-operative cognitive decline, or post-operative cognitive dysfunction related to anesthetics. And it is very suggestive that, yes, there may be an association.
Any other questions from... Yeah.
Thanks. Anise Yusuf from Prince of Wales in Sydney. This was one of our registrars, by the way, and it was...
This one?
Yes, she was. It was at a teaching hospital, which is our sister hospital, and it was one of the rare places, this was not common, where the nurse actually would put the local anesthetic in a bottle and put the chlorhexidine as well. And the mistake was made, it was late at night and early. No other hospital had done that. And I guess the other cardinal rule which was mentioned was that as an anaesthetist, you should always draw your own drugs up and check it before administration, check it before discarding. So I think probably that was the cardinal rule. There were all sorts of discussions about the color of the chlorhexidine. We, at the smaller hospital where I do obstetric anesthesia, we did have a bad habit of the nurse showing you the ampule and just putting in the local for the skin. We've stopped that practice altogether and instituted the fact that as soon as the chlorhexidine has been used, it is verbally taken off the trolley and said loudly to the team to stop this sort of thing happening. Thanks.
Any other comments from the audience? Yes, Doctor. We'll come back to you, Dr. Kamdar.
Yeah, regarding the drug safety, I'm very sorry to say that we have many anesthesia company which have come with anesthesia drugs, but I think except one company, rest of the companies, they are not following the color coding.
Yeah, we keep mixing up the ampules.
No, there is no color coding at all, except the one company. If you leave neon, rest of the company, I think they are not following the color coding. Because there was a case report in Indian Journal of Anesthesia in which they put atracurium intrathecally because the ampule color and the color of the...
I think many of us has faced that problem of intrathecal atracurium. in my hospital also it happened,
And even many
Just
companies,
because
they are not
color
following the
coding
color
is not-
codings.
Yeah.
No, I think
Maybe Neon is one of the
Yeah,
pioneers
that's the
in
only
this.
company.
No,
Yeah.
that's a very fair point because because of the financial problems we have within the NHS, almost every month there's a totally different drug supplier, and we have our the antiemetics, which now have a similar color to more serious drugs, and it's so easy to pick up the wrong drug. And we have highlighted because of this. The drug company says that it's not their problem because if we follow the double checking properly, then we wouldn't have any problem is what they say. But that's not the point, isn't it? So the NHS has raised it with the companies and said that it's their responsibility as well to ensure that patient care is improved.
Okay.
So the thing, we have the same issue where because of issues with supply of drugs, exactly as Purva said, every month the drug that used to be green is now red, and the drug that used to be blue is now purple, and the drug that used to be in a square one is now in a round one. And it's this. So we're used to this now. But I know we talk about double checking and everything and all these protocols. There's absolutely no substitute for reading the label. You have to read the label every single. I don't care what color it is. I don't care what shape it is. I don't care what it is. You read the label every single time.
And another take on that, the older you get, please keep changing your number of the glasses, you see. Don't rely on your resident. So with this note, I thank all our panelists, Dr. Kajal, Bill, Purva, Ketan, and Bhavani for a nice and interesting panel discussion. And thank you very much, audience, for your interactive session. Thank you.